The morning sun was just beginning to peek through the windows of Atlanta International Airport as Dr. T walked briskly through the terminal, his carry-on bag rolling quietly behind him. As one of the country's top brain surgeons, he was used to these last-minute flights to help patients in need. Today was no different. A critical case awaited him in Chicago. He'd been up since 4 a.m., finishing rounds at his hospital before heading straight to the airport. His dark blue sweater and neat khaki pants were comfortable enough for travel, but still gave him the professional look he always maintained. 20 years of medical practice had taught him to always be ready for anything, even on what seemed like a routine flight. The first-class lounge was quiet when he arrived. He found a peaceful corner and pulled out his tablet, reviewing the medical files that had been sent over. A young patient needed his help, and every minute of preparation counted. As he scrolled through the brain scans, his forehead wrinkled with concentration. He'd done this surgery hundreds of times, but each case was unique, each patient special. "Would you like some coffee, sir?" a lounge attendant asked, noticing his focused expression. "Yes, please. Black, no sugar," he replied with a warm smile. He'd learned long ago that kindness to everyone you meet makes the world a better place, no matter how busy or stressed you might be. While waiting for his coffee, he made a quick call to the Chicago hospital. "Yes, I'll be there by 2 p.m. Please have the latest vitals ready, and make sure the OR is prepped according to the protocol I sent." His voice was calm but carried the natural authority of someone who had spent decades saving lives. Around him, the lounge started filling up with morning travelers, business people in suits, families heading on vacation, all blending into the usual airport buzz. Dr. T checked his watch again. The flight would board in 30 minutes. He had just enough time to review the surgical approach one more time. His phone buzzed with a text from his daughter. "Good luck with the surgery, Dad. Love you." A gentle smile crossed his face as he typed back a quick thank you. Even after all these years, his family's support meant everything to him. When the boarding call came, he gathered his things carefully, making sure he had everything he needed. His surgical tools would be waiting at the Chicago hospital, but he always carried certain essential items with him. Walking toward the gate, he heard snippets of conversations, people talking about meetings, vacations, home. For him, this was just another day of trying to make a difference. The gate agent greeted him with a standard "Good morning, sir," as she scanned his boarding pass. First class was a necessity for him now, not for luxury, but because he needed to arrive fresh and focused for his patients. As he walked down the jet bridge, he went through his mental checklist one last time. Finding his seat, 3A, by the window, he settled in, placing his bag carefully in the overhead compartment. The leather seat was comfortable, and he looked forward to using the quiet flight time to finalize his surgical plan. Other passengers filed past as he pulled out his medical journal, the latest issue still in its protective sleeve. Little did he know that this routine morning, this regular flight that he'd taken countless times before, was about to turn into something entirely unexpected. But for now, he was just another passenger, albeit one carrying the responsibility of a young patient's life in his skilled hands. The flight attendants began their usual safety demonstration as the plane pushed back from the gate. Dr. T politely paid attention, though he knew every word by heart. Years of flying had taught him that respect for safety procedures was as important in the air as it was in his operating room. As the engines hummed to life and the plane began taxiing, he opened his tablet again, diving back into those crucial medical files. In just a few hours, he would need every detail fresh in his mind. The morning sun now fully illuminated the cabin, promising what should have been just another day of saving lives. The plane had barely reached cruising altitude when the first signs of trouble began to brew. 3 rows behind Dr. T, a middle-aged woman in a floral blouse kept glancing nervously in his direction. She'd noticed him the moment she boarded. A tall, well-dressed black man who seemed unusually focused on his tablet, constantly checking his watch. At first, she tried to ignore her rising anxiety, busying herself with the in-flight magazine. But then she overheard fragments of his phone conversation just before takeoff. "Everything needs to be ready. Time is critical. We can't afford any delays in the procedure." In her mind, these ordinary medical preparations took on a more sinister meaning. The woman's hands trembled slightly as she pressed the call button. When the flight attendant arrived, she spoke in whispers, her voice shaking. "I don't want to cause any trouble," she began, her eyes darting toward Dr. T. "But that man up there, he's been acting strangely, making suspicious calls about procedures and looking at technical diagrams on his tablet." The flight attendant, a veteran of 15 years in the sky, looked toward Dr. T. She saw him studying what appeared to be complex technical images, making notes with quick, precise movements. In another context, it might have seemed perfectly normal. But in the heightened atmosphere of air travel security, even innocent actions could appear threatening. "He keeps checking the time," the nervous passenger continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "And he has this intensity about him. I know I might sound paranoid, but isn't it better to be safe?" The flight attendant maintained her professional composure, thanking the passenger for bringing her concerns to attention. Protocol required her to report any suspicious activity, no matter how slight the possibility of actual threat. She made her way to the front of the plane, where she discreetly informed the lead attendant. Meanwhile, Dr. T remained absorbed in his work, completely unaware of the drama unfolding around him. He was reviewing the intricate details of tomorrow's surgery, marking critical points in the procedure that would require special attention. Occasionally, he would glance at his watch, not out of nervousness, but from the habitual time awareness that every surgeon develops. The lead flight attendant stepped into the cockpit to inform the pilots. Within minutes, a series of coded messages were exchanged with ground control. Standard procedure dictated that they take no chances, especially on flights to major cities. Dr. T finally looked up from his tablet when he noticed an unusual amount of activity in the first-class cabin. Flight attendants were moving back and forth more frequently than normal, speaking in hushed tones. He thought nothing of it at first. He'd been on enough flights to know that minor issues often required such consultations. He took a sip of water and returned to his medical files, making another note about the surgical approach he planned to use. The images on his screen showed detailed brain scans. To the untrained eye, they might have looked like any kind of technical diagram. Behind him, the nervous passenger had now worked herself into a state of genuine fear. Every movement Dr. T made seemed, to her anxious mind, to confirm her suspicions. When he reached into his bag to pull out a medical journal, she flinched visibly. Other passengers had begun to notice the tension. A businessman across the aisle tried to focus on his laptop, but kept stealing glances at the unfolding scene. A young couple a few rows back whispered to each other, picking up on the nervous energy that was slowly spreading through the cabin. The flight attendants maintained their professional demeanor, but their movements had taken on a subtle urgency. One of them passed through the cabin with a phone handset, speaking quietly into it while glancing periodically at Dr. T. As the plane continued its journey northward, 2 air marshals on board had been quietly alerted. They sat in different parts of the cabin, maintaining their cover while assessing the situation. From their vantage points, they observed Dr. T's behavior, looking for any signs of genuine threat. Dr. T stretched in his seat, completely oblivious to the fact that his routine flight was about to become anything but routine. He was thinking about his young patient in Chicago, mentally preparing for the delicate procedure that awaited. The irony of the situation, that his dedication to saving a life was being misinterpreted as something sinister, would soon become painfully clear. The first hint that something was seriously wrong came when the plane suddenly slowed on the runway, veering slightly from its path toward takeoff. Dr. T looked up from his tablet, his surgeon's instinct for subtle changes immediately alerting him that something was off. The engine's steady roar decreased to a quiet hum. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, professionally neutral. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a slight delay. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened." A ripple of murmurs spread through the cabin. Dr. T glanced at his watch again. Any delay could impact his patient in Chicago. That's when he noticed them. 2 men in plain clothes were making their way up the aisle, their movements carrying the unmistakable authority of law enforcement. Their eyes were fixed directly on his seat. 20 years of handling high-pressure situations helped Dr. T maintain his composure, though its heart rate quickened slightly. "Sir," one of the air marshals addressed him quietly, leaning in to avoid drawing attention, though by now most passengers were watching intently. "We need you to come with us." Dr. T's response was calm and measured. "Is there a problem, officers?" He kept his hands visible on the armrests, years of flying having taught him the importance of clear, non-threatening movements in situations like these. "Please gather your belongings and come with us, sir." The second marshal's tone left no room for discussion. By now, phones had appeared throughout the cabin, their cameras capturing the scene. The quiet whispering of fellow passengers created an unsettling backdrop. Dr. T slowly stood, his movements deliberate. "I'm a surgeon," he explained, maintaining eye contact with the marshal. "I have an emergency surgery scheduled in Chicago. The hospital is expecting me." He reached for his medical ID, but the marshal quickly raised his hand. "Sir, please keep your hands where we can see them. You can explain everything once we're off the aircraft." The walk down the aisle felt endless. Dr. T could feel the eyes of every passenger on him. Some looked away uncomfortably, others stared openly, and a few continued filming. The nervous passenger who had reported him pressed herself back in her seat as he passed, clutching her purse tightly. As they approached the exit, Dr. T tried once more. "Officers, I have a young patient waiting for me in Chicago. This surgery is time-critical. If you could just verify my credentials." "Sir," the first marshal interrupted firmly but not unkindly, "we'll sort everything out shortly. Please cooperate with us." The jetway felt cold as they escorted him off the plane. A small group of TSA agents waited at the gate, along with 2 local police officers. The terminal that had been bustling with morning travelers just an hour ago was now strangely empty, the nearby gates cleared of waiting passengers. Dr. T's mind raced, not with fear for himself, but with concern for his patient. Every minute lost could have serious consequences. Yet he knew from experience that the calmer he remained, the faster this might be resolved. He'd faced subtle and not so subtle prejudices throughout his career, but never quite like this. One of the police officers stepped forward, hand resting casually on his belt. "Your carry-on will need to be searched, sir. Please stand over here." They directed him to a clear area near the gate podium. As the officers began their inspection, Dr. T spoke clearly and professionally. "My name is Dr. T. I'm Chief of Neurosurgery at Atlanta General Hospital. In my bag, you'll find my medical license, hospital ID, and the case files for a critical surgery I'm scheduled to perform in Chicago this afternoon. Time is extremely important here." The officers methodically went through his belongings, his tablet with the medical images, his journal, his credentials. Every item that had seemed suspicious to the nervous passenger now told a different story, one of a dedicated physician rather than a threat. More airport police arrived, creating a small crowd of uniforms. Passengers waiting at nearby gates watched the scene unfold, some shaking their heads, others filming with their phones. Dr. T stood patiently, his posture straight but unthreatening, his expression composed despite the growing frustration he felt inside. The whole situation would have been almost absurd if it weren't so serious. A highly respected surgeon being treated like a security threat because of a nervous passenger's assumptions. But Dr. T knew that losing his temper would only make things worse. Instead, he focused on what mattered most, his patient in Chicago, waiting for the surgery that could change their life. Meanwhile, in Chicago's leading children's hospital, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. The head nurse checked her watch for the 5th time in the past hour, then glanced at the young patient's vital signs on the monitor. The numbers weren't looking good. "Has anyone heard from Dr. T?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady as she adjusted the patient's IV line. The 12-year-old boy lay still in the hospital bed, his worried parents sitting nearby, holding each other's hands tightly. They had traveled hundreds of miles to have Dr. T perform this specialized surgery. He was the best, they'd been told, the only one who could help their son. The boy's father looked up hopefully each time someone entered the room, but each time his expression fell when it wasn't the doctor they were waiting for. His wife squeezed his hand harder, trying to share strength they both desperately needed. Down in the operating room, the surgical team was already preparing, laying out the specialized instruments that Dr. T had requested. The scrub nurse carefully checked each tool against the list he had sent ahead. Everything needed to be perfect. This kind of delicate brain surgery left no room for error. Still no answer, the OR coordinator announced, hanging up the phone for the 10th time. His phone's going straight to voicemail now. The team exchanged worried glances. This was completely out of character for Dr. T, who was known for his perfect reliability and constant communication. Back in the patient's room, the monitors beeped steadily, but the numbers continued their slow decline. The head nurse made another note on the chart, her forehead creased with concern. They had planned the timing of this surgery carefully. Waiting much longer could make things significantly more risky. Should we start looking for another surgeon? One of the residents whispered to the chief of surgery in the hallway. The chief shook his head slowly. There's no one else in the region qualified to perform this specific procedure. Dr. T developed the technique himself. He's literally written the book on it. The boy's mother stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Chicago skyline. Somewhere out there, the surgeon they were waiting for should have been landing right about now. He'll be here, she said softly, more to herself than anyone else. He has to be. The hospital administrator joined the growing group of concerned staff members outside the room. What's our backup plan? She asked quietly. The chief of surgery showed her the patient's latest scans on his tablet. These are the affected areas, he explained, pointing to several spots. The complexity of the case is why we specifically requested Dr. T. No other surgeon has enough experience with this particular condition. Inside the room, the young patient stirred slightly. When is the doctor coming? He asked, his voice weak but curious. His father forced a smile. Soon, buddy. Very soon. He shared a worried look with his wife, who had returned to their son's bedside. The head nurse stepped out to make another call, this time to the airport. Yes, we're trying to locate a passenger on the flight from Atlanta. It's extremely urgent. A medical emergency. She listened for a moment, her expression growing more concerned. What do you mean, there's been an incident? The OR team continued their preparations, but the tension was palpable. Every piece of equipment was ready, every instrument in its place. The anesthesiologist reviewed his charts again, knowing that timing would be crucial once they finally got started, if they got started. Time seemed to move both too quickly and too slowly. The chief resident paced the hallway, alternating between checking his phone and looking at the clock. They had planned to start prep 2 hours ago. The delay was pushing them dangerously close to their safety window. The boy's mother noticed one of the nurses frowning at the monitor and clutched her husband's arm. Something's wrong, she whispered. They're not telling us everything. Her husband stood up, preparing to ask for answers, when the head nurse rushed back into the room, phone in hand, her face pale. We've just received word, she announced to the gathered staff. There's been a situation at the airport. She lowered her voice, but the boy's parents could still hear. Dr. T has been detained by security. They're not letting him leave the airport. The news hit the room like a physical force. The boy's mother sat down heavily, while his father's face flushed with anger and disbelief. The medical team looked at each other, their expressions a mix of shock and growing concern. They all knew what this could mean for their young patient. The hospital administrator immediately pulled out her phone. I'm calling our legal team, she said firmly. This is completely unacceptable. But everyone in that room knew that legal intervention would take time their patient might not have. The questioning had been going on for 20 minutes in a small room at the airport security office. Dr. T sat calmly at a metal table, his credentials spread out before him, explaining his situation for what felt like the 100th time. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as 2 senior TSA officers reviewed his documentation. A younger TSA agent stood in the corner, shifting uncomfortably from foot to foot. Something about Dr. T seemed familiar to him, but he couldn't quite place it. He watched as the doctor patiently answered another round of questions, noting his professional demeanor even under these stressful circumstances. And you say this surgery can't be performed by anyone else? One of the senior officers asked, his tone skeptical. That's correct, Dr. T replied, his voice steady but urgent. I developed this specific surgical technique. There are only 3 surgeons in the country qualified to perform it, and I'm the only one available today. Every minute we spend here puts my patient at greater risk. The young agent's eyes suddenly widened. He stepped forward, then hesitated, not wanting to interrupt his superiors. But as Dr. T continued explaining the procedure, memory clicked into place. Sir, the young agent finally spoke up, his voice cracking slightly with nervousness. I think I know who he is. All eyes in the room turned to him. Last month, at the Medical Innovation Conference, he continued, gaining confidence. My sister's in medical school, and I went with her. Dr. T was the keynote speaker. He showed videos of this exact same procedure. There was a standing ovation. People came from all over the world to learn from him. The senior officers looked at each other, then back at Dr. T, who remained composed but nodded in confirmation. The young agent pulled out his phone, his hands slightly shaking. Look, I took pictures at the conference. There he is on stage. He showed them a photo of Dr. T giving his presentation to a packed auditorium. My sister said he's revolutionized this type of brain surgery. She has all his research papers saved on her laptop. One of the senior officers leaned forward, looking more closely at the hospital ID badge on the table. Then he checked the photo on the young agent's phone. His face slowly changed as realization dawned. The patient, Dr. T said quietly but firmly, seeing the shift in the room. A 12-year-old boy. He needs this surgery today. Please. The second senior officer was already on the phone. Get me the hospital in Chicago. Yes, I need to verify a surgeon. Dr. T, yes, we have him here. The next few minutes were a blur of activity. The hospital administrator's voice came through on speakerphone, a mix of relief and controlled anger. We've been trying to reach you for hours. Do you realize we have a critical patient waiting? The senior officer's face had turned red. Ma'am, there's been a serious misunderstanding. We're releasing Dr. T immediately. The young agent rushed to gather Dr. T's belongings. I'm so sorry, doctor, he said, handing over the tablet and medical bag. My sister would never forgive me if she knew I was part of delaying you like this. Dr. T stood, straightening his sweater. You spoke up, he said to the young agent. That's what matters. Despite the urgency of his situation, he took a moment to place a reassuring hand on the young man's shoulder. Tell your sister to keep studying hard. We need more dedicated people in medicine. The airport's security director had arrived, profusely apologizing. We'll have you on the next flight to Chicago immediately. A police escort will take you directly to the terminal. As they rushed through the airport, Dr. T's mind was already back on his patient. He'd lost precious hours, but there was still time. He pulled out his phone, now returned to him, and began calling his surgical team in Chicago. Behind them, the young TSA agent watched them go, still holding his phone with the conference photos. He thought about his sister, about her dreams of becoming a doctor, about all the things she'd told him about breaking barriers in medicine. He looked down at his badge, then at his phone, and made a decision. This story wouldn't end here. Something needed to change in how they handled security protocols. The security director was already in his office, making calls to his superiors. The nervous passenger who had reported Dr. T would need to be interviewed. Procedures would need to be reviewed. But for now, the priority was getting one of the country's top neurosurgeons to his patient. As Dr. T was rushed through the terminal, other travelers stopped and stared. Word had started to spread about what had happened. Some people were filming with their phones, others were shaking their heads in dismay. A few recognized him from medical journals or news articles about his groundbreaking surgeries. The young TSA agent watched until Dr. T disappeared from view, then looked at the last photo on his phone, the one of the standing ovation at the conference. He thought about how differently things might have gone if someone hadn't recognized who Dr. T was. About how many other professionals might have faced similar situations without someone speaking up. About how much needed to change. The private jet's engines roared to life as Dr. T buckled himself in. The airline had arranged this emergency flight after realizing their mistake, but precious hours had been lost. He checked his watch. It was now early afternoon. His mind raced with calculations about the surgery timeline as the plane taxied toward the runway. We'll have you in Chicago in under 2 hours, doctor, the pilot announced over the intercom. Air traffic control has given us priority clearance. The co-pilot gave him a thumbs up through the cockpit door. Everyone on board understood the stakes. Dr. T pulled out his tablet, forcing himself to focus on the surgical plans rather than the time lost. The cabin felt eerily quiet compared to a regular commercial flight. A flight attendant brought him coffee without asking, noticing his intense concentration. His phone buzzed with updates from the Chicago hospital. The young patient's condition had gotten worse. The boy's blood pressure was rising, and he was showing early signs of the complications they'd feared. The surgical team was prepping everything, ready to start the moment Dr. T arrived. "Doctor," the flight attendant said softly, "we've arranged for a helicopter from Chicago Airport to the hospital. It'll be waiting when we land." She paused, then added, "My nephew had brain surgery last year. Different hospital, but I understand how important time is." Dr. T nodded gratefully. Throughout his career, he'd learned that behind every medical case were real people with real connections, all linking together in unexpected ways. Even in this crisis, that truth remained clear. Back in Chicago, the hospital was buzzing with controlled chaos. The chief of surgery paced in his office, phone pressed to his ear. "Yes, I understand transferring the patient is an option," he was saying, "but moving him now carries its own risks. Dr. T is already in the air. If we wait..." Down in the OR, the surgical team was running through their prep for the third time. Every instrument had been checked and rechecked. The scrub nurses had memorized the layout Dr. T preferred. The anesthesiologist reviewed the patient's latest charts, making minute adjustments to his plans. In the waiting room, the boy's father held his wife's hand as she finally broke down. "What if we made the wrong choice?" she whispered. "Maybe we should have gone to Boston instead." Her husband pulled her close. "We chose the best doctor for our son. He'll be here." The private jet cut through the clouds, flying at maximum allowed speed. Dr. T had abandoned any attempt at reviewing notes. Instead, he closed his eyes, mentally walking through every step of the upcoming surgery. He'd done this procedure many times before, but never under such pressure. His phone lit up with another message from the hospital. The boy had started showing symptoms they couldn't ignore much longer. The backup plan, moving him to another hospital, was looking more necessary with each passing minute. But Dr. T knew that transport itself could trigger the very complications they were trying to prevent. The flight attendant's voice came over the intercom. "Doctor, we're starting our descent into Chicago. The helicopter crew has confirmed they're ready for immediate takeoff once you arrive." On the ground, a police escort was already waiting to rush Dr. T from the private jet to the helicopter pad. The hospital had coordinated with local authorities, clearing every step of his route. In the distance, storm clouds were gathering. They needed to get the helicopter in the air before the weather turned. Dr. T gathered his materials, every movement precise and purposeful. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him, not just for this patient, but for every person who had helped get him here. The young TSA agent who spoke up, the airline staff who arranged the private flight, the police waiting to escort him, the surgical team standing by, and most of all, the family putting their trust in his hands. The plane began its final approach. Through the window, Chicago's skyline came into view. Somewhere in that maze of buildings, a young boy and his family were waiting, holding on to hope. Dr. T took a deep breath, centering himself. Despite the delays, despite the frustrations, despite everything that had gone wrong, he knew what mattered now was what he would do in the next few hours. The landing gear deployed with a thud. In the hospital OR, the team was making their final preparations. In the waiting room, the boy's parents looked up at every footstep, hoping for news. And in the sky above Chicago, a doctor who had faced discrimination and doubt, prepared to do what he had trained his entire life to do, save a life that needed saving. 7 hours after landing in Chicago, Dr. T finally stepped out of the operating room. He pulled off his surgical cap and took a deep breath, the events of this extraordinary day catching up with him at last. Behind him, the OR team was finishing up, their tired faces showing both exhaustion and relief. Despite everything, the surgery had been successful. In the waiting room, the boy's parents jumped to their feet as Dr. T approached. He could see the worry lines etched deep in their faces after the long hours of waiting. "Your son did very well," he told them, his voice gentle but confident. "The surgery was successful. He's in recovery now." The mother burst into tears, falling into her husband's arms. The father reached out to shake Dr. T's hand, but instead pulled him into a quick hug. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "We've heard about what happened at the airport. That you still came, that you didn't give up." Dr. T patted the father's shoulder. "Your son is the hero here," he said quietly. "He stayed strong until we could help him. That's what matters." A nurse appeared to take the parents to recovery, where their son was waking up, already showing positive signs. As Dr. T walked back to his office to complete his surgical notes, his phone buzzed with messages. The story of what had happened had spread quickly. News outlets were requesting interviews. Medical colleagues were expressing their outrage and support. But one message caught his eye. It was from the young TSA agent who had recognized him. "My sister's graduating medical school next year," the message read. "What happened today? It's made me realize how much work we still need to do. I've spoken with my supervisors. We're starting a new training program. Would you be willing to help us develop it?" Dr. T smiled slightly as he typed his reply. Change often started in unexpected ways, with small moments of recognition and understanding. He had learned long ago that anger wouldn't solve these problems, but education and patience might. The next morning, as he checked on his patient, Dr. T found the boy already awake and alert. The early signs were better than he hoped for. The delay hadn't caused any complications after all. The boy looked up at him with curious eyes. "Mom says you flew here special just for me," he said softly. "That's right," Dr. T replied, checking the monitors. "I wouldn't have missed it." He didn't mention the obstacles he'd faced to get there. This young patient didn't need to know about the darker parts of the story. Later that week, the airline's CEO personally called to apologize. They were revising their security protocols, he explained, and wanted Dr. T's input on how to better handle similar situations in the future. The nervous passenger who had reported him had written a lengthy letter of apology, asking to meet in person to apologize face to face. But Dr. T was already focused on his next cases. In his office at the Chicago hospital, where he'd been asked to give a series of guest lectures, he reviewed files of other patients who needed his help. The incident had sparked important conversations, but his priority remained the same as always: helping people who needed his skills. A month later, he gave a speech at a medical conference. He didn't talk about what had happened at the airport. Instead, he spoke about the advances in surgical techniques that could help more young patients like the boy he'd operated on. But during the queue of the session, a young medical student raised her hand. "Dr. T," she said, her voice clear and strong, "your story has inspired so many of us. What would you tell other doctors who might face similar challenges?" He thought carefully before answering. "Focus on what matters most," he said finally. "There will always be obstacles, but remember why you chose this path. Every patient is someone's child, someone's parent, someone's loved one. That's what I think about every time I walk into an operating room." The boy from Chicago made a full recovery. 6 months later, Dr. T received a video of him playing basketball with his friends, as if he'd never been sick at all. The boy's parents had become advocates for both medical access and airport security reform, turning their experience into positive change. The Young TSA Agents training program was implemented across several major airports. Dr. T occasionally gave guest lectures to security personnel, sharing his perspective not with blame, but with hope for better understanding. Small changes began to add up: better communication protocols, more thorough credential verification processes, increased cultural awareness training. 1 year after the incident, Dr. T stood in an operating room at his home hospital, teaching a new generation of surgeons. Among them was that young TSA agent's sister, now starting her residency. She had chosen neurosurgery, inspired partly by the story she'd heard about that day. "The most important thing," he told his students as they prepared for surgery, "is to remember that every challenge we face, every obstacle we overcome, helps us become better doctors. But more importantly, it helps us become better human beings. Now let's begin."